Carolina Chapel Hill. She is also a faculty fellow there, doing some amazing work in the early education health equity space. Even just seeing her comments in the chat, I was thinking this is going to be an amazing session. So thank you all for joining us. I want to make sure that we have time at the end for questions and answers. And so I will go ahead and give Dr. Iruka an opportunity to present at this time.
Thank you so much. It's Dr. Bowler. Did I say that right, Dr.
Yes, yes, yes.
Perfect. Well, I have to come down off my high because I came in a little bit late to the meeting, the main meeting. And so I just have to come down a little bit. So, I get all hyped up. So thank you so much. I'm so thrilled and honored to be part of this National African American Child and Family Resource Center virtual convening. And it's just an amazing, I'm just glad that this center has finally happened. And I'm glad to also meet you. And hopefully it will not be our last time coming together. So I think I should be able to get access to be able to click through. So welcome everybody. I really hope, hold on, click start. What? Okay. I should be able to get it right. I said click start, okay.
Yes, we see you. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure I could, I don't think I can't do the slides yet. So let me know when it actually happens.
Okay.
Okay. So let me know whenever it happens, or you could just laugh at me if it makes it easier. Yeah. Can I switch out? Can I do my slides?
I think let's see.
Can I actually request already? I think it said it gave it to me, but I don't see it. So whenever somebody gives me instruction, I'm happy to, but we can proceed.
If you can go to the bottom left of your screen, controls should pop up using your mouse.
Yeah, it didn't pop up. Yeah, no, I thought it would, but it didn't. Yeah, I'm looking at my screen and I have the regular stuff on here. Okay. Do you want to try it again? Go ahead, Christine, what were you saying?
Okay, give me 1 second.
Okay, well, while they're getting started, we don't want to delay because I feel like, so whenever they'll let me know what to do, but either way, you can look at the first slide. So my job here today with you all is to talk about early education. Now, I just want to say this before we even get started, is that so there's early education and then there's early care. And I would just say for me and my brain, I really do work across the early childhood education space that includes issues of subsidy, Head Start, early Head Start. But either way, so I'm doing early education, and I really want to focus us on Black children's access, experiences, and outcomes. And I really, in particular, wanted to frame it through access, experience, outcomes, because I think in many instances we focus so much on access issues, but we really don't understand that if you don't really attend to the actual experiences in programs and services, that it sort of undermines the purpose of having access, right? Because it could be traumatic and detrimental for children to be experiencing things that they really shouldn't, especially in the most vulnerable years. So my take-home message, in case, I want to make sure we have enough time to have a conversation, is the following. One is, yes, we could all agree that high quality, culture affirming, family, engaged early care education matters for children. So I think we can agree to that. But we also, for me, we also have to recognize the issues of access and experience and outcomes, that three-legged stool, we have to kind of fully attend to that and not just focus on one or the other. And then the third thing I want to make sure to leave you with is that we need a more holistic, and I would say racial equity, but really, I mean anti-racism. But, I don't know how the National African American Center is doing, but I talk a lot about anti-racism because it's the undercurrent of everything in this country, including early care education. But there's a need for us to really begin to really think about what does it mean to have an equity-centered anti-racist kind of early child program and opportunities. And then finally, okay, click start. It says click start to, I must have missed it again. I don't know what I'm missing. It keeps saying click start, but I don't see it. So, oh wait, I lied. Okay, I lied. What? I thought I lied. Yes, I do lie. Okay, yay. Thank you so much, Kristen. Thank you. So this is my take home message, because I feel like it's easier to give you a take home so you know where I'm gonna go. Like, I want you to know the destination, Google map it. And so you know, as we get on the road, that you know where you're going. And so these are my take home message, right? That high quality education matters. We need to recognize the three stool of access, experiences, and outcomes. We need a holistic, anti-racist, equity-centered approach to early education, both in early and Head Start, early Head Start and Head Start. And I know some of y'all gonna push back, but don't. And then finally, we need to really make sure that equitable systems, including early education, leads to what I call the 3 Ps of protecting, promoting, and preserving children's families' health, wealth, and educational experiences and excellence. To me, if we're not doing this for Black people, Black children, Black families, then I have to question whether we're doing what is necessary and needed for our community and our people. Okay, good. I couldn't tell if I had access. So I'm gonna go through this part quickly because I feel like if you're in the room, you probably already get early education in the science of it. So I'm gonna just quickly go through this sort of like, so we're all on the same page about the science of early development as we know it today. One is we know that early experiences are essential for building the brain connections. And there's really the underlying, really the healthy development from the inside out, right? So we can all assume, again, it doesn't have to be in a building. It doesn't have to be in a particular kind of program, but we do know that early experiences really help to connect the synapses and all those neurons, right? We also know that early adversities can change the timing of critical periods of brain development. But I want to flag this one, that people talk a lot about adverse child experiences. But I will argue a lot of that data never talks about racism, discrimination, and bias. So I would say, while I sort of was part of this particular National Academy's report, I want to also call out that some of our evidence has not fully, I think, unearthed the impact of racism in all of its forms. And then third, we know that the healthy development begins in the preconception period. So I'm really happy that at least early Head Start, obviously that started in the 1990s, I think 96 if I'm correct, right? That we have to think about those preconception period because we know a lot happens. And for our children, it's even more important, particularly when our data continues to show us that Black children in particular are born either preterm or low birth weight at a higher level than other children. And so this is important that we think about the preconception period as well as when children are born. And then I want to also flag that in the end of it, we know that relationships really do matter. We know whether it's relationships with your nanny, with your kinfolk, with your cousins, those relationships matters, but it's really those relationships between adults, including our families, our fathers, our mothers, our community mothers and fathers, that they can buffer the negative outcomes that happen, especially when you're dealing with adversities like a COVID-19, when you're dealing with issues around racism and discrimination, all of manifestation. And so we do know that having these really supportive relationships are really important and really essential, because in the end of it, the children don't get to command their spaces. They're relying on us, the adults in the room, to make sure that they are thriving, that they are healthy. And then finally, a couple of things. Oh no, how do I go back? Oh darn. How do I go back? Can you help me go back one more? If you can I do that? I can't see the controls for some reason. It's kind of weird, but it's okay. I think I can do it one more time. Thank you. So I want to leave with these two things around the science of early development, which is that we know that access to basic resources is really important, particularly for our community, because I can show you 300,000 different data that continues to show that our community, and it was exacerbated by COVID-19 especially, that we were really experiencing a lot of material hardships, whether it was housing, whether it was food, whether it was healthcare, childcare, name it, we were experiencing it. And we know that those kind of stressors are really, really, they impact children, they impact families. For me, I grew up in the projects in Boston, and I remember, right, having to figure out my mother, I can only imagine how she felt, having to figure out where my kids gonna eat, where are they gonna, lay their head? I can only imagine what she was feeling. And so we have to understand, when you can't meet your own or your children's basic needs, what is that really doing to the healthy development of both the child, but also the parent? And then finally, I was happy to probably underline this one, that now we actually now know, and I think the science community is starting to begin to really bring this forward, at least in early childhood, that both institutional racism and experiences of discrimination can influence the health and well-being of both adults and the children in many complex ways that we have not been able to really unearth. And so I'm hoping that, obviously, with the work that I do with many partners, but also the National African American, Child and Family Research Center, that we can begin to really show what are the impacts of racism, both in communities, but also in early education programs. And then I'm going to share with you this particular slide that in many ways to me encompasses the way I think about early education, but also to me, I think about it from this holistic kind of lens. And this work, I want to say, is part of work that I'm doing with the Rise and Network that I helped co-founded. And I think I see one of my good fellows here, Amber Sansbury, as well. And so I sort of, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular figure. Hopefully the paper will be coming out soon. But really what I think is important for us to do when we think about early education, but even other things like healthcare, Social Security, is that we have to begin to look at how structural racism in all of its different forms, from systemic to structural to institutional to interpersonal and even internalized racism, how all those really impact the larger ecosystem that children and families reside in. However, I think it's also critical that we address the family and community assets that exist, whether it's our spiritual capital, whether it's our resistant capital, like the idea that we would even try to be joyful, the idea that we even try to push back with our brilliance and our energy and our just ways of being and moving, right? So those are assets that we have to continue to make sure comes forward, so people don't just look at us as the pity, but that we need the country to do what it must do. We need early education to deliver on the promise, but we have to recognize all of the assets that we're having to bring into the situation and the impact of this across intergenerations. We need to understand the intergenerational effects of racism, of discrimination. And I think the more we understand that, the more we can begin to really push on what really matters that impacts the well-being of children and families. And so eventually you'll see this particular framework come through, and I hope to share it obviously with the National African American Child and Family Research Center. So I keep looking down a little bit because I gotta find this little clicky thing. So I'm gonna just quickly go through just some of the data. And again, you'll have my slides, you can look at it. But again, I wanna flag that, Head Start, I'm talking about Head Start and early Head Start, that, half of Black children are served by Head Start, with of course variation across states. And that's at a higher level than other children of color. Similarly, the same thing with early Head Start, obviously at a much lower level. About 6% of eligible Black children are served by early Head Start. Again, they vary across states. And I put the top 10 states, the top at least few states where Black infants and toddlers are served. Again, we do know that not all babies that could be served are served. And we see this across the board. Again, there's many reasons for that we can talk about. So there's an access issue, but then there's also the experiences issue. This data is a little old, but it's something that I need to run the new data, but the pattern is still the same, which means in essence, compared to other kids, right, white children, Latina children, I don't have the data for Native Americans, but we consistently see that Black children are less likely to be in high quality programs, at least as determined, because I could argue about the measurement itself, but using our current metric of quality rating, we still see that Black children are likely to be in lower quality care versus other groups of children. We see this in every other data, like pre-K data from whether it's New York City, whether it's Boston pre-K programs. We see this pattern. And the reason why for me is even more insulted is that most of our national seminal studies, both the Carolina Abecedarian study at UNC where I'm located, and also the high school preschool program where I was located previous to come back to UNC, they were really done on, the participants were primarily Black people. So the fact that much of our evidence that continues to show that the importance of early childhood education intervention was really because of Black children and families saying yes, and the fact that they still end up in low quality programs, even for a federal program like Head Start, even for statewide pre-K programs like, et cetera. And so I think it's something for us to look at is how do we keep ending up in programs that are at least rated by the current system as lower quality. And then here is data from one of our larger Educare Learn Network. And I should say the Educare Learn Network is actually a public-private partnership. Most of the public partners are actually Head Start or early Head Start. And so again, thinking about the metrics that we have, from the data we have, it just shows basically that Black children or children in Black majority schools are likely to be in this sort of similar quality care as sort of whether it's you're in a Black majority school or Latina majority schools, that their quality of experiences are likely the same. Again, I use the word likely because, again, these are global measures. The ECHR is a global measure, the class is a global measure. But the question is, even with them being in sort of the similar care, we still find disparities in experiences. So obviously, I'm not going to show this continual data we all have seen, which is the fact of Black children, even though they make up less than 20% of the public preschool population, they still are the ones that are likely to be suspended and expelled. Even though this is data from 2011, 2012, we saw the numbers even recently that still indicates that even if the numbers come down, the racial disparities, particularly for Black children, is still very high. So that's something that we have to begin to attend to. Is not just the exclusionary policies and practices, but then when they're there, are they really there? Are we really supporting their full needs? Again, we know that Head Start prohibits programs from expelling or unenrolling children. And so it's important to have these policies in place. But we also know that there's soft expulsion and things happening where you don't have to throw them out, but there are ways that you make it almost uncomfortable for the child to be there. But I think it's important that we have policies and standards that at least it means that you're going to work a little bit harder before you throw, literally throw children out. In terms of outcomes, and this is a lot to read, and I don't think you need to really worry about it in terms of reading it, and you'll see the source there. But in essence, even for early Head Start, we do see a lot of positive child and parent outcomes for Black children, particularly around parent sensitivity, as well as other sort of home environments. So in the end of it, I'm trying to say that there's access issues. There's some access in terms of Head Start. It's more access, less access for early Head Start. But the outcomes and experiences we have to examine, and we should look not just at child outcomes, but also at family outcomes. And the fact that we are seeing some positive outcomes when it concerns whether it's children's outcomes, but parent outcomes. But with early Head Start, we do see a particular impact on parent sensitivity, their ability to really engage responsibly and in a contingent way with their child. Again, these are positive things. And I should also know that many parents do that anyways outside of early Head Start, outside of Head Start. So I think it's important that we also don't make it seem like Black families need a program to be great parents. They're great parents because they are doing the best that they can under the condition that they have been placed in. And then, of course, I won't belabor the Head Start impact studies. We do see few child and parent outcomes for Black children that at least last until kindergarten. Again, I'm going to underscore, it does not mean that we should not fund Head Start. It just means that we may need to be really thoughtful about the outcomes that we're measuring for children and families. I will question whether the outcomes are culturally grounded, are they culturally relevant? And so again, while I may say that some of the outcomes don't last beyond kindergarten, I think we need to be much more intentional to question, are the outcomes the right ones? And what does it mean when you're part of Head Start, a community that really tries to support families, support the workforce, and is part of embedded in the community as well. And I'm going through this a little fast because I want for us to kind of get to the discussion because I think that's more important. And then when I just think about issues, sort of what does this mean policy-wise? I think a lot about in the end of it, while we can change practices, change a couple of things, I think it's really important that we change policies both at the local level and state and national level. And that means that we have to address issues of access, whether it's equitable funding, meaning that we need to fund programs, including Head Start, early Head Start, in ways that commiserate with their communities. If your community has been historically underfunded or disinvested from, we should be funding it so that they're at the same level as sort of those other communities, right? So how do we think about equitable funding? How do we think about authentic integration? How do we think about our family childcare homes and friend and family neighbor, where the majority of kids, particularly young babies, are located? And then what about access to early intervention and special education? I can go on and on about the issue of inequities in early intervention. But again, we need to think about access in a more holistic way. And then experiences, we have to think about our workforce who are burnt out, underpaid, undervalued, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do we think about the experiences that if you're a stressed out teacher, I'm not sure I need you to take care of children, because that means that there's a lot that you're having to contend with. And the fact that we're underpaying you and using all of your own economic and social and emotional wealth, especially when we have not given completely to our workforce, something we have to think through. We have to think about our measures, our curricula. I, of course, argue that is our curriculum ever culturally responsive for Black children, especially? Is it African-centered? Is it leaning in on the brilliance, the historical brilliance of of Black people from the continent, right? How much are we really creating experiences that really tell Black children that you are a genius, as Dr. Jackson and the Village of Wisdom team, continue to remind us? What are we doing about family leadership, right? What does that really mean in terms of a family in a more expansive term, right? When we think about our kin folks, we think about our village mentality, how do we make sure that we are bringing the family together? And then what do we think about monitoring and accountability in our CQI? To what extent are they addressing the root of inequities and the root of cultural assets in many ways? And then, of course, I'm going to say that our flagging report that we did it in terms of how do we think about Head Start as a foundation for a universal system. Now, if you heard me speak before about Head Start, I could tell you a lot of stuff that I may not be particularly happy with Head Start, but I think Head Start is still a federal system that really provides opportunities to really center Black children, because that's how it started. And so how do we look at availability and access at the neighborhood level, expanding existing and new Head Start grants, new Head Start partnerships with community-based programs, even friend and family neighbor care, for crying out loud, pre-K programs. How do we really integrate research and TA more concretely into Head Start, fund state advisory? So there's a lot that I think I will argue when we think about early education. How do we use Head Start as a foundation? It's not perfect, but it's a really strong foundation to build from, right, for our early Head Start level and even the Head Start level. So how do we think about that in a really concrete way? And then, of course, for me, as I think about early education, I think about the Black Child National Agenda that I was lucky to work on with the National Black Child Development Institute. And I'm just going to flag that part of it is really around this issue of both ensuring equity in early intervention, addressing harsh and discipline practices, expanding universal access and experiences to early education. But of course, other things that include child tax credit, income supports, and family medical leave, and so many other things, of course, and reparations, right? So there's many things I can talk about when we think about early education, but really it's about the early years and how do we ensure that the early years is what it should be. So my take-home message again is that we should continue to think about early education, but we have to be a bit more, I think, intentional, a bit more inquisitive. We have to think about, are the systems really, including early Head Start, are they really protecting our children and families from harm and other sort of racialized incidences? Are they promoting our health, but also our wealth and access to educational excellence? And are they preserving our community, our culture, our language in many ways? To me, if we're not doing some of those things, how we get into equity-centered approaches in early childhood writ large. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and I'll hand it back to Dr. Bowler.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iruka. Am I saying your name correctly?
You are. You call me Iyoma. I feel like we're like in a community here, so I'm totally fine with going by Iyoma, but if y'all are being official, then fine.
Well, thank you so much for your enlightening presentation. It was phenomenal. I want this portion of the session to be conversational. If you are comfortable with even showing your face and raising your hand, I will go in that order. Also, too, we do have the chat feature as well if you want to pose your question that way. I will kind of get us started off with the question, and then, you all, as you are comfortable, feel free to raise your hand, or you can write your question in the chat, and then I'll relay that information to Dr. Iruka. So my first question is, you kind of highlighted this earlier where you were discussing some of the quality rating concerns that you have, the problematic nature when it comes to early child care centers. What adjustments do you believe are needed to improve the cultural relevance of those rating criteria?
Well, that's a big one. And so I'll try to keep my response short-ish. Because again, it's one of those where, of course, I should probably not say, when you create a system, in any system that's created, you can guarantee that it's probably going to be inequitable unless you did a lot of work to decolonize it, to really engage the community, especially communities of color, Black communities specifically. So you can imagine that the quality rate improvement system is different is different across every single locality and states. However, the challenge is that a lot of times they're using metrics that is inexplicably going to position providers that are Black especially really to often be viewed as less than. So let's take education. Like education is one of the biggest criteria in the quality improvement system. If you know the history of the United States of America, you know for a fact that Black people are often going to have less education, not because we're not smart, but because to get through a BA degree, to get through third grade, for crying out loud, to get through high school, and then to get through, any kind of degree, whether it's community college or four-year college, that's going to take a lot of effort and also a lot of money. And so the fact that we use education as one of the markers is often going to position either programs led by Black people, owned by Black people, to probably be rated less than. The other thing is the measurement that are used. Again, I'm not going to trash the measures because I work and collaborate with many of the measures, including one here at UNC. But again, the measures were often done by white people using white normative lens. There's nothing inherently wrong, not take that back. The problem is that they don't really address things that may matter. So let's take for example, here's one good example. One of the items in one of our measures is called intrusiveness. So a lot of times people go look at a classroom, right, with a Black teacher, for example, and you use a direct tone, they're going to ding you on your intrusiveness or that you're being a mean teacher. Your tone is not good enough. And that could actually drop your rating down. And that has actually economic implications, right? Because the higher your rating, the higher your reimbursement rate. So that means you get more money for the kids you take care of. And so when you have systems that really are based on education, based on measures, again, measures that are good, but are not fully integrated into sort of, Black culture or even the ways Black people may move, in many ways, it positions programs led by Black people to be less than and lower quality. And that has implications for both the program owner, the program leaders, but also the children and families and the community that is part of. So there's a lot to be said about what QIS, the challenges. But I will say that in many ways, the pandemic and I think coupled with the racial reckoning of summer of 2020, at least helped us to finally say, early childhood, we know you love babies, allegedly, but you clearly don't love babies all the same. And the systems and the way that it's created, sometimes you haven't looked at it from a racialized lens. So can we do that now? So I do feel like there's now a bigger attention across both the national Fed states, but also now local entities to begin to say, to what extent can we do better with our systems? Like in California, right? They're now looking at, are we reimbursing things? How do we reimburse better? How do we make sure that we're not in many ways undercounting the assets that many of our communities of color, our Black communities and our Latina communities, how do we make sure that we're not negatively impacting them? So I think there's some work that's happening, but again, it's going to be one of those where the system has been in place for at least 20 years, at least here in North Carolina. So there's going to be a lot of work to undo it and then really create what I would call a culturally affirming, anti-racist kind of quality rate improvement system.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As well, anyone, if you're interested in asking a question, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. And I was just wanting to think about something practical for families, teachers, parents. I know earlier you noted that, ACEs don't take into consideration racial inequities or prejudice that's being experienced. My question would be, what would be your suggestions, based on your work, your research, and even interventions that you've been working on? What would be your advice for parents to kind of buffer, Black children from those potential adversities that they may experience based on their race? Like, what would be like your suggestions for conversations or concepts or, practical things that we could do to kind of buffer children from those effects? Even if you're a teacher or working with children in some capacity, like what would be some of your advice?
I know. Well, thank you for that question. And it's one of those where I'm like, I don't want us to have to do anything else anymore. I feel like we already do so much. Like we already do a whole lot. Just like as a mother of two young Black kids, I feel like I've done enough just to birth them and I'm still alive and they're alive and I think they're happy, right? So I feel like I've already done all my job. Why do I got to do more? So with that in mind, and so I feel like, why don't other people go do their kids and go focus on how much white supremacy is impacting just us? So I feel like we're having to do work for a problem we didn't create. And that's what
Right.
when one of our surveys that we have engaged with called the Rapid EC study, right? I remember one of the parents said, well, why do we have to continue using our energy to go fix a problem that we had nothing to do with, but we're severely impacted by? So with that said, I feel like what we know from the evidence is that part of what we do is what we call cultural socialization, right? So this is where we really try to make sure, if nothing else, and we start really early, right? We begin to really make sure to remind kids that, number one, you are loved, right? Number two, that you are beautiful, that you are a genius. So we do a lot of that. And also to make sure that children have a different lens about their people, because a lot of what kids see, even as early as 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months, a lot of because people think kids don't talk about race and don't know anything about race until they're 15. Kids know about race. My daughter came home at the age of 3 talking about, Mama, let me go ahead and change my skin, because all my friends and the teachers talk to them. And so kids are really aware, because you know what? Kids are brilliant. They know how to observe and see stuff. They know who the teacher's talking to and not talking to. So for me, part of it is that, how do we make sure that children are able to get a counter narrative, whether it's through the stories we tell, through the people that they see, right? Like being able to see other people who look like you, who look like your cousin, who look like your daddy, who look like your granddaddy, being able for them to see others who are in different levels of position, of leadership, so that they get a sense of, you are better than what the media tells you. And the media meaning, whether it's early child programs, whether it's other people in the community, whether it's the books, the apps, the TikTok and all that stuff. Like, I think it's important that we make sure that our children are completely endowed to know the brilliance of who they are. And the last thing I feel like for me is something that I'm working on as a parent, is that I feel like I've been drinking the white supremacy Kool-Aid. Like, I was birthed in it. I grew up in Boston. I went to Boston Latin School. I went to Boston University. I went to the University of Miami. I have been drinking white supremacist, white dominant Kool-Aid. And here I got a whole African name. Yomi Rook is a whole African name. And I felt like I never really knew the gift of African people, right? From our philosophy to our doctors, to so much of who America says that they are is actually from Africans, right? From the continent. So for me, I'm trying to figure out, how do I make sure that my kids understand that Americans' history is actually stolen Black history from Africa. So for me, it is important that our kids know information and know history in ways that no matter what somebody tells them about their worth and value, they know, I literally do come from kings and queens. I literally do come from the first philosophers. I do come from the first doctors. I do come from the first bankers. I think we need to make sure that they literally are drinking it from the moment that they're born to the moment that they die, because the more you know who you are, and not from who somebody tells you, then to me, you can at least begin to walk in a way that says, even if you try to step on my neck, I'm going to continue to move forward. So for me, that's work that I'm doing in myself, but also in my own household. And I think this is what we have to do both in our early child programs and also in our home. If we are not able to push back on the counter narrative on a daily basis, our kids are going to be fed the idea that they're not good enough. And that is something that a lot of us are still dealing with today.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing. I think the way you opened it up was, just so profound. We've done so much already. Why put the weight back on us, and teaching them their true identity, as well as an understanding of who they are, where they come from, and the richness involved in that. Thank you so much for sharing such practical and helpful advice. And so now we're going to get to a few questions from the audience, and we'll get started with Amber Sansbury. You can feel free to unmute your microphone at this time.
Hi.
Hey, Amber.
Hi, I just want to first give a shout out to my mentor, Dr. Ruka. Thank you for everything you do in this work. The question I have for you, you spoke a little bit about it, parenting outcomes, and we're just starting to kind of unpack, the history of Head Start, how we understand Black parenting in a more race-conscious way. If you could speak to that a little bit more, particularly with the establishment of the center and the work that you're doing at UNC and with the Riser Network, what do you hope for the field when we think about Black parenting and what we know about it? What more do you think we need to be challenging as far as that? Yeah.
Oh, that's a great, thank you, Amber. I'm so glad you're here. I was love seeing your beautiful face. The idea of Black parenting is actually odd, right? Because at the end of it, like every parent is so individual in how they parent. Like, I mean, I read a whole book. I taught, I teach a whole course, but I'm like, the way I parent, I'm like, I'm not putting this in the book. I think it's acknowledging that, we all got our different way of parenting. And I know I parent my 2 kids. They don't know that. I parent them differently. I mean, I'm like, look, Aries, I'm going to treat you like your sister, Elani. So we know we are individual. But with that said, knowing that parenting in many ways is individual, is also based on how I was parent, and I don't want to be parented, or et cetera. So there's a lot of those historical pieces. But what I hope, especially for the National African American Child and Family Research Center, I try to say it often, is that we begin to sort of unpack what is quote unquote group parenting, right? Because in all of our data, all the coding, there's always, I could blink and I'm gonna tell you what it says before they even code it. All right, Black parents aren't doing reading, Black parents are being mean to their kids, Black parents are controlling their kids. To me, I'm like, no, I want us to make sure that as we measure Black parents, that we measure us by us in the way that people should see us, right? They should measure that fact. First of all, I don't parent by myself. Even if say I'm fortunate to be married to the father of my kids, right? But even if I wasn't, I think we need to begin to show how we parent as a community, right? The fact is that, look, my mama may not be in my house, but I tell you right now, she's trying to parent my kids. I know my auntie, who is not my blood relative, is trying to parent my kids, right? So we need to recognize the way that some of us parent is actually from a village kind of sort of a way of it, right? We also have to acknowledge that there's a lot of parenting that happens even before kids are born, right? A lot, like before my kid was born, one of my first kids was born, I was thinking about, okay, what child care am I gonna put them in? Am I gonna put them in a child care? And what are they gonna look like? So I was already thinking about a lot of things that I wanted them to experience and not experience, right? I also wanted them to be able to live and thrive in many ways. So there's a lot that we are thinking about that our current day measure does not capture. They don't capture that just because I got a PhD and I may live a middle income life, they don't capture that that's a vulnerable state no matter what. Because it's not like I tattoo my degree and my income and on my forehead. It's like when somebody see me walking out the street, they see a Black woman. That's it. And so I think that, and then I parent knowing that. And so I think we have to be much more expansive in what is parenting, who is parenting, because if we don't do that, then I feel like we're going to sort of say, how good am I a parent in relation to a white dominant way of parenting, when white parents don't have to think about losing their kids. Like for me, when I had a son, I'm like, you don't know what it's like to be a Black mother, right? And just like I don't know what it's like to be a Black father, but that level of that level is one that we have never talked about, right? That when you're a Black parent, whether a Black biological parent or foster parent or parent, if you're any kind of parent figure or caregiver of a Black child, there is a level that the parenting measures have never addressed. There is emotional level, a level of stress that's kind of bubbling underneath that. At the same time, the joy that we're trying to bring to children so that they know no matter what they tell you, you are great, right? And so for me, it's explaining those measurements to take into account the diversity and the complexity of how we are as a people and the diaspora of Black parenting, right? Caribbean parents, African parents, Black American, and I think we need to expand that in many ways.
Oh, I love that. And what are you specifically, that was such a wonderful question, Amber. Thank you very much. What are you hoping to see from the center itself?
Shoot, I say, do y'all. I love that question. You know what? At first, I'm just happy to see the center. Like I remember, like at least a decade ago, I was like, how come there's the tribal center, which I love working with? There's a whole, Hispanic center over here, and I'm like, where's the Black center? So first of all, I'm just glad that y'all are here. I'm glad that the center is in an HBCU because we need to continue to make sure that the institutions that make sure that we're thriving are here. So what I do hope is that you're able to create the bridge and bridges between all the different sort of researchers that are in this space. But most importantly, to me, to do the counter narrative. Like as a national center, we have to speak to racism, even in the face of, both federal, not federal this time, but state policies that are actually literally trying to limit our ability to talk about Black experiences, our ability to talk about the racism in early childhood in K to 12 in public systems. So for me, I'm hoping that the center will continue to push on the counter narrative, which is what HBCUs already do, but do it now in this early childhood space, where to me, there's always been this sense of, you know what, Head Start is great, right? Early Head Start is great. Early education is great, but yes and no. And so I feel like I hope that there's going to be this deeper counter narrative. I do hope that there's going to be this mobilization of the community to really support you all, right? So for me, I feel like it's not about what you all can do. I think it's you all creating the space so that researchers like me know, look, the National Center said this is what we should be doing. And so I need y'all to have an agenda so I know what I need to be doing as a researcher in a historically white institution called UNC. So for me, it's more about what can we do to make sure that we are elevating the National Center and that we are also supporting the work that you all are doing and creating those connections and networks, particularly in the early education space that has primarily been white. So I feel like for me, it's more about what can I do to make sure that the National Center is the excellence of what I know it already is.
Thank you so much for sharing. So now we also have a question from Aaron James Neal. You can feel free to unmute your microphone as well as you'll show your video.
Hi, Aaron. How you doing? Thank you so much for that really great presentation. I had a question about one of the points you brought up about teacher burnout and the role that you were saying that it's playing in early childhood education. And I was wondering what you think some of our policy initiatives or what you think some of our thoughts are about not just teachers, but also like providers across early education institutions and what we should be doing to support those folks. And if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, I have a whole lot of thoughts. So first and foremost, I want to make sure that we all understand the early child is not one thing. That's the problem we have, right? Early child is actually bifurcated, right? You got your pre-K over here. You got your Head Start, early Head Start over here. You got your community-based providers who are both center, school, and home, and even our friend and family neighbor. So we got a whole, and they treat them differently. Mind you, they're pretty much doing the same job, but they're treated vastly different. They're valued vastly different. If you go to any state house and they're talking about early childhood, they're probably talking about pre-K, right? They're talking about the pre-K. You know what pre-K is? Pre-K is basically where they're like, okay, you are now a real teacher, right? You got the credentials, you done made it through praxis, so you're a real teacher. And so we're gonna make sure we give you all of this stuff. Again, they're all still tired and burnt out. So when I think about the burnout, so remember, even before COVID, a lot of teachers and providers were already managing a lot. Here I was at home I've been at home for a minute and I got 2 kids and I thought I was going to just die. So imagine here you are, an early educator, and you got 18 kids and, and maybe you have an assistant, and so it's a 1-to-8 ratio, give or take. And imagine how much you have to, and kids don't just sleep, right? People think you just sleep. There's nobody sleeping, right? They're like, oh, you're just babysitting. Even if you're babysitting, that's still a lot of work. And so imagine the amount of energy it takes to create a lesson, to get the classroom together, to manage children with different needs, those who gotta, eat, poop, and like all that stuff, right? So imagine just managing basic function. And then you have to now engage these young people who, it's all about the ego. They're all about themselves. And so imagine that level. And then you come to find out you're making $9 an hour. So the average amount of money being made is $9. And now if you're in pre-K or in the K to 12 system, it's a little bit like $26. But the majority of programs are actually in the community-based program. And of course we have Head Start, but Head Start pays probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's like $13, maybe in some instances a little bit higher. So and so imagine if you live in DC and over there in Seattle, even here in North Carolina, you are close to poverty, if not close to really being economically vulnerable. And so on top of really being this educator, this brain builder for young people, you are probably stressed. And our data shows that a lot of our teachers and educators and providers are getting social benefits. So that means that they qualify for benefits. So that means that we are not only burning through them on a social emotional level, but we're burning through them economically, that they are subsidizing us. When you underpay somebody for the quality of care that we want, somebody has to pay for it. So it's either that provider, it's either their partner, somebody's paying for it. And so to me, there's a burnout both in terms of the mental anguish that they've had to deal with even before COVID. And now there's a whole nother level that they have to deal with. And I'll just tell you this one last story. In the throes of the pandemic, especially in that first sort of 6 months, remember that many state executives, the governors often said, okay, pre-K, Head Start, they were staying home, but the childcare was essential. They had to stay open. And if you hear from a lot of our friend and family neighbor care, our home-based providers and owners, and even some of our smaller sort of programs, you will hear them talk about that during the throes of the pandemic in the early times, they had to figure out the food, the PPE. They were shedding tears and stress at a level that none of us ever experienced. And to me, we have never addressed that issue. And imagine they were not being fully paid. Yeah, some of them got some, stability grants, but we have not fully paid them for them. Some of them were taking out loans because a lot of things weren't available at the level they needed it. So to me, the burnout is on many levels. And that's why we have a lot of early child programs that are not open. In some states, it's not as bad, but in many other states, it's really hard to find somebody to basically say, I'm gonna take care of 20 kids, and then you're gonna pay me basically $10.20. Like, who's gonna do that, right? And so I think we need to think about burnout, but that means that they've been with us for a long time. A lot of our providers, particularly Black providers in particular, have been with us for a long, long time. And the fact that we still have to fight for policies and bills to pay them basically basic wages. They're not asking for a wealth transference. They're not asking for $20,000. They're asking for at least pay me enough so that I can take care of the babies that I care for and that I love. And the fact is that we're fighting for that. And the reason why, Aaron, is because we have racism and sexism baked into the history of early child education. I won't go into it any further, but Krishana Lloyd over there in the other session, who's doing the early care, has a paper out called Mary Popper that talks about the history of early care education. And part of that is because enslaved women, enslaved Black people were the early childhood providers. Remember, they were forced. And I think in many ways, our policymakers, who are primarily old white men, often see childcare and sort of women and women of color as babysitting, and do not see the value of overpaying for a babysitter. So to me, the issue of the workforce is one that's really baked into sort of sexism and racism. And I think the more we can actually talk about that pretty clearly and directly, the more we can say either you pay them or get out of the space, right? Either we pay them and say, you know what, we don't want to pay you because we just think you ain't doing anything. So for me, the burnout is on many levels, and I think we've taken advantage of them long enough. So sorry for my long old answer, Aaron, but I have many more answers I can give, but that's where I will start.
Thank you. That definitely answered a lot of the questions that I had.
Thank you for your question, and thank you, Dr. Iruka. There's a comment in the chat from a center director who works directly with a lot of her parents, and was just emphasizing, that she talks to parents to let them know that they are their children's first teacher. And we're thinking about the impact of family engagement, when they're looking at those different indices and determining outcomes for children in Head Start. What are they looking at in particular, and what can we kind of encourage, centers to do? What can we encourage parents to do to really promote some of those optimal outcomes for children?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I'm sorry I didn't see it in the chat box. So thank you. I can only imagine what it's like to be a center director just before and now, obviously, during the pandemic, since we're still in it, and knowing that the kids under the age of 5 are not able to get vaccinated. So there's even a different level of pressure as the country continues to open up. So just thank you for that. And then, so family engagement is my first love, my first area of expertise and research. And I did my PhD in family engagement actually down there at Head Start in Miami, in the South Florida area. So for me, that's always been who I am, is really around that family engagement, leadership, support space. So I would say, obviously, with Head Start, I mean, we can give them credit that they were, they're one of the only programs I think about multi-generational. How do we make sure that we are really engaging and enriching children's lives, but also thinking about the families, right? Whether it's the fathers, whether it's the mothers and other caregivers, right? And making sure that they're part of like the policy council, right? Like they get to really have a huge say in what happens in the programs in many ways. And so I think there's a level of attention to families. But of course, I should say many Head Start programs also have like what they call family navigators or family engagement specialists. So there's at least an attention to how do we make sure that we don't just try to quote unquote fix kids, but we also are really attentive to the whole family system. And I think that's something really important that I feel like still gets ignored in our other kind of early child facing programs. Like they forget that you don't have to just focus on the kids, right? Because the kids are going to be fine. It's really about how we focus on the whole family system, because in the end of it, you're going to leave, but the family and the family system are still going to be there. And so when we think about, what to really attend to, I think it's really figuring out how do we make sure that families are still central in Head Start, right? How do we still make sure that they feel like their voices are activated? How do we make sure that what families think are important or is important, right? A lot of times it's attention to making sure that families get referrals, making sure that, they get. And of course, I think that's important. But I think it's also important that Head Start continues to recognize the wealth and the assets of many families, right? That many families are doing a lot, like they're doing a lot of storytelling. They're doing a lot of engaging with communities. They're doing a lot of different ways to support each other, even outside of Head Start. So how do we make sure that we continue to elevate the assets and the ways of being, especially Black families, into the sort of the Head Start programming, but even at the same time, making sure that families have the voice to sort of either push back on policies that they think is not affirming them, or that may be undermining their own sort of needs. And so for me, I think Head Start is still a really important, has an important lens about family engagement. But I do think that there really needs to be an attention to how do we make sure that we begin to unearth how racism, how biases impact families. Because when you're living it, I can only imagine my mother, when you're living a level of poverty and stress, there's only so much you can really do, right? Because you're trying to figure out, how do I put food on the table? How do I make sure that there's shelter over my head, right? There's a lot that you're focused on. And I think it's really important that Head Start and all those that are part of Head Start begin to say, how do we make sure that these families don't come back around, that their kids don't come back around? So for me, is how do we address the issue of intergenerational poverty, but also intergenerational harm? So that's one. The second thing is, I would like to see Head Start be much more engage in the civil rights, right? Because Head Start actually came into civil rights, but I would like to see them much more really leaning into the issues of civil rights, whether it's housing rights, whether it's sort of, community, whether it's even about, African-centered teaching and culture responsive practices. Like for me, I would like them to engage much more in the fact of, you started under the sort of war on poverty, right? You started under that level. And for me, it's important that child development is actually part of human development and human dignity. And for me, Head Start is still an important national program that really sets a lot of foundation. But I want them to be even to lean in more in the fight for civil rights, the fight for human rights, especially for Black people, and of course, arguably other communities that are marginalized. But I would like for them to be much more explicit about how much issues of whether it's police murders and other kinds of traumatic experiences, how much they really are impacting families at different neighborhood levels. And for me, I wanted to speak on those issues and be able to speak of it with housing, with the criminal justice and Department of Justice. I want them to lean in a little bit more. But again, I know that they have this space to lean into, but I would like them to be much more about the whole entire family and community level, rather than just the space of child development.
Yes, thank you so much. Because the reality is that the children are seeing it, even if we're not talking about it, and having that safe space to know that we care about these issues too, I think would be extremely powerful. Yeah, so we are kind of getting close to time. We have probably an opportunity for at least one more question at this time. Or if not, we can have closing remarks from our speaker, just some nuggets that you definitely want to make sure that we leave, this discussion with.
So at first I see Krishana Lloyd over here. Krishana, drop down your paper, the Mary Popper paper. I don't know why you're here, but no, I talked about it. You can Google it really. But I will leave you with the three things. And for me, it's always going to be around my 3 Ps, which is that I think we have to continue to make sure that our children, families, and communities and educators are protected from just racialized trauma. That is being felt on a deep level biologically, which is why we found out really yesterday that we lose 5 years, that Black people are dying at a much higher rate at 5 years compared to white families. So again, we need to be protected from a lot of these racialized and hardships, and our health and wealth. to me, we can talk about poverty all day long, but we need to talk about wealth generation. The fact is that we have been excluded, and we are still being excluded, including this housing market, for example, from wealth generation. And of course, our issues of health cannot be, we can't keep talking about that, but it's a fact. And then of course, I think we need to make sure that we are really clear about what does it mean to be Black in America, talking about Black, the preservation of our culture. The fact that we speak African-American English, it is a language system. It's not broken English. It is a language system that we have to continue to honor in many ways, including our cultural heritage, our tradition, our HBCUs, our institutes like the NBCDI. To me, if we are not preserving who we are, we will be lost. And so for me, those are the things that I leave you with, is to make sure that we're protecting, promoting, and preserving the best of who we are in many, many ways. So thank you so much. And I'm so thank you for the center, just for the fact that you all are here and for just being able to bring us together. And I hope we could be in person one day. So thank you for allowing me to speak to you all.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing. We see a comment in the chat from the Office of Head Start just released their agency priorities. They're advancing equity, supporting programs, pandemic response and recovery, investing in the workforce, reaching more children and families. So kind of in alignment with a lot of your amazing suggestions as well. So I think our breakout session will close automatically. Thank you so much for sharing. This has been phenomenal. It's been so helpful to hear your insight and the work that you are doing in the early education space. And I know that we have all left with some nuggets to move forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.